Okay everybody, we've covered a lot of ground in the last 2 years that the Cold War has been on the air. We've covered the airlift, the Suez Crisis, and the formation of NATO. We've also looked at active US intervention in places like Korea, as well as more covert interventions in places like Iran and Guatemala. And the common thread behind them all? Well, to counter the spread of communism. All these US actions were taken in line with the Truman Doctrine, also known as containment, which I know we have made plenty of references to so far. However, we've not actually talked about the policy of containment itself, or George Kennan's long telegram, which helped define over 40 years of Cold War policy for the United States. The famous telegram from the US Embassy in Moscow outlined what a single State Department worker saw as unsolvable differences between how the Americans and the Soviets saw the world. Differences and conflicts which would not end without the collapse of the other system. Communism and capitalism could not coexist, but any real war between the two superpowers would be, safe to say, apocalyptic. The debate on how to face such a threat when nuclear weapons were a fundamental part of the question was still in its infancy, and two powers locked in an ideological conflict had never occurred before on such a scale. Containment emerged as the American way to fight that struggle and set the stage for the entire American approach to international relations regarding communist countries. So, before this subject becomes even further removed from the timeline of our tour of the Cold War, I guess it's time we talked about containment. This is the Cold War. Yes, I'm a gamer. No, I won't go to therapy. Speaking of gaming, today's sponsor is Conqueror's Blade, a free-to-play tactical MMO on PC set in a vast open medieval world, and allows players to create a warlord, build and command an army, and conquer an empire. Warlords are created from 11 unique weapons classes and use their special abilities to win in 15 versus 15 epic cinematic battles. Unleash the might of the Northmen, winged hussars, tercio arquebusier, and lots more. Conqueror's Blade is getting constant updates, and the new 7th season, The Wolves of Ragnarok, adds 3 new units: Berserkers, Shield Maidens, and the Sons of Fenrir, all alongside a new siege map, inspired by Norse architecture. Conqueror's Blade has a special offer for our viewers. Everyone who registers through our link in the description gets a free 7-day premium account, which gives 30% boost to earned hero and unit XP, bronze coins, and honor, as well as additional vault keys for the completion of weekly quests. Like so many of our videos, we need to begin our story during the Second World War. As that conflict came to a close and talks turned from how to win the war to how to win the peace, and in fact just what that peaceful world was going to look like, the US and USSR immediately began to butt heads. In the US State Department, frustration with Stalin started to grow, as did suspicions that the Soviets would use the post-war redrawing of the map to make a massive land grab. In fact, even before the end of the war in places like Poland, the US began to see behavior which confirmed their worst fears. One person who was enormously influential in this critical juncture of US foreign policy was George Frost Kennan, a diplomat working for the US State Department. During the last year of the war, Kennan was assigned to be the deputy head of mission at the US Embassy in Moscow at the personal request of Ambassador Averell Harriman. The orders from Washington were to ensure that strong cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union were maintained. Kennan bristled at this, as his experiences in Europe led him to believe that this relationship would not work. Keep in mind, not only had Kennan worked as a Sovietologist at the US Embassy in Riga in the early 1930s, but he also had been part of the team that established the first US diplomatic mission to the Soviet Union starting in 1933. He had also more recently worked with the European Advisory Commission as a counselor working on Allied plans for the post-war period. Kennan, arriving back in Moscow, worried that if the US did not move away from its conciliatory position to a more aggressive foreign policy against the Soviets, that the USSR would overrun Europe even after hostilities had ended. He felt that the Western European countries, if they had a hope of surviving Soviet ambitions, would need to put together a federation to counter them quickly. Near the end of his term in Moscow in 1946, the US Treasury came to the US Embassy in Moscow to ask for a report to provide some clarity over what was seen as confusing Soviet actions. Specifically, Soviet disinterest in joining the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. Kennan's response, like a good internet comment well before its time, was a 5,000-word telegram. Also, like a good internet comment, he didn't so much answer the question, but instead outlined a frustrated screed about what the US should be doing regarding Soviet relations. In what has become known as the Long Telegram, Kennan outlined that Stalin needed an exterior enemy at all times to justify his autocratic rule. Once the threat of fascism was behind them, capitalist countries would be next. Because of this and what he called historic Russian xenophobia and paranoia, the Soviets would never be anything but an adversary to the United States. Furthermore, they would fight a perpetual war on capitalism, using any Marxists in capitalist countries as pawns to launch communist takeovers worldwide. He prescribed a building of institutions in the West to resist Soviet influence until the Stalin-era Soviet Union mellowed with age, like a fine bottle of Havanskara. In a later article published in Foreign Affairs magazine under the pseudonym X, he took an even harder stance. Instead of blaming Russian national culture, he saw the root of Soviet aggression as part of Marxism-Leninism. The ideology was irreconcilable with capitalist countries. According to the article, Stalin was ideologically driven to overthrow Western countries in order to consolidate political power in Europe. To counter this, Kennan argued that America's long-term strategy must be the patient but firm containment of the growth of Soviet influence. No negotiation would be possible. They must be responded to with counterforce. This idea of containment would become one of the three competing theories on how to best deal with the Soviet Union in American foreign policy circles in the late 1940s. Isolationism was one with a significant amount of popularity, especially among conservatives. The Midwest and the conservative wing of the Republican Party wanted to ramp down the military and go back to the limited foreign policy which America had practiced before the war. Now, this opinion wasn't overwhelmingly supported by Americans, but it did have islands of representation in government. What hindered it primarily was the prevailing idea at the time that American isolationism had helped to start the Second World War in the first place. Now, another popular idea was one which would pop up several times during the Cold War: détente. The idea of détente is to focus diplomatic efforts on trying to lower hostilities and rebuild the working relationship they held during the war. We will talk about this later in the series as it becomes more relevant to the timeline. Periods of relative quiet in the Cold War did occur because of these ideas. In fact, Richard Nixon's presidency is actually famous for it. As for America in the late 1940s, the idea of détente found its support from those fairly far to the left of the political spectrum. It's not often that Nixon and the far left see eye to eye, but that's what 20 years of shifting politics will get you. And the third main foreign policy idea prevalent in the US at the time of the Long Telegram was well to the right of center: rollback. This was the idea that communism must not only be contained, but actively attacked and pushed back. An early example of this thinking was Operation Unthinkable, which proposed betraying the wartime alliance and moving past Berlin to Moscow. That never happened, obviously, but it was discovered by Soviet intelligence and soured the post-war relationship. While Unthinkable turned out to be, just as the name implied, unthinkable, the thinking behind rollback did show up in practice, like, for example, during the Korean War. General megalomaniac MacArthur more or less got fired for proposing a rollback strategy over Truman's policy of containment. Even Eisenhower briefly considered a rollback strategy, examining an intervention in the 1956 Hungarian uprising to roll back communism. It turns out, however, that in these cases, World War III is a pretty big deterrent. So, Truman took the Long Telegram to heart. Containment became so entwined with his outlook that it often goes by the name of the Truman Doctrine. In fact, Truman's first significant move of the Cold War was his request for funds to support Greece and Turkey's governments to contain communism. Containment was a rejection of isolationism, but still a middle ground between détente and rollback. It was one a Democratic president with a Republican Congress could get behind. However, what Truman's real motives and ideas actually were is up to a lot of scholarly debate, and I do mean a lot. That being said, many early Cold War programs, like the Marshall Plan and NATO, can be interpreted as containment policies put into practice. The Truman Doctrine and containment would shape a fair amount of US Cold War policy. The next 3 presidents would try to contain communist expansion in places like Iran, Cuba, and Vietnam, often at odds with the desires of the people who lived there. Even the foreign policy of Ronald Reagan could count as a reigniting of containment policy and revivifying the Cold War in its last years. But you'll need to stay around and watch way more of our content before we get into all of that. I mean, I guess you could go read a book, but what's the fun in that? Actually, you should read a book. Just make sure you keep coming back here each week. Much of US foreign policy, for good and ill, would be informed by that fateful telegram. Whether or not it was a successful strategy, well, I imagine we'll see a very spirited discussion of that down in the comments. It did succeed in firmly moving America from a relatively isolationist country into one of international intervention and even accusations of empire building, something which continues to impact the world we live in today. The results of these interventions, however, have often been extremely disruptive, if not downright devastating for local populations, and often their neighbors. It's not often you see one document have such a profound long-term impact on a nation's policy and then the entire world in its repercussions, and yet Kennan's Long Telegram is most certainly a prime example of just that. We hope you enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have prevented the expansion of the bell button. We can also be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, please consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.